the 1980s, screenwriter Joe Eszterhas, a being who was formed when a van carrying Drakkar Noir and strip club chicken wings collided with toxic waste, produced two of the biggest hits of the decade, Flashdance and Jagged Edge. This led to a bidding war on his next project, a psychosexual thriller set in San Francisco called Basic Instinct. After a feeding frenzy, Carolco Pictures emerged victorious, paying $3 million for Eszterhas's 13 days of work, which was a record paid to a writer at the time. Eszterhas's films tend to revel in their own particular brand of sleaze, with heavy sexual content, graphic violence, social nihilism, and the occasional critique of power structures that never seems to tip over into actual text. Because of the tawdry nature of his screenplays, Eszterhas gained a reputation for being an overpaid hack, especially when guys like Jag Mundra and Gregory Dark were doing basically the same thing for pennies on the dollar. Basic Instinct upped the stakes though, with Carolco dropping $3 million for Eszterhas's script, $5 million to director Paul Verhoeven, and another $15 million to star Michael Douglas. There would be more micromanagement, more acrimony, and more ego-stroking than you could shake an ice pick at. But from that circular prick-waving firing squad came a $400 million genre-defining smash that's alternately been called the most blatantly misogynistic film in recent memory, a film that does more for female empowerment than any feminist rally, and biphobic as f***. And all of those things can be true, depending on whether your reading of the movie is from a preferred or resistant perspective. This video has some magna cum laude spoilers, so check out the film first if you're interested. Basic Instinct is hardly the first erotic thriller, but it might be the most famous. If you're wondering why it's the subject of a horror channel, it's because Basic Instinct really is nothing more than a glossy, horny American giallo film, a genre that shares its film noir origins with the erotic thriller. And of course, none of these genres are mutually exclusive. Basic Instinct follows Nick Curran, a reckless detective investigating the sex murder of a nightclub owner named Johnny Boz. Boz's author girlfriend, Catherine Trammell, becomes the prime suspect because she wrote a fictionalized version of the murder right down to the gory details, years before the murder actually happened. Against the advice of his partner and best friend Gus, Nick gets sexually involved with Catherine. This puts a target on Nick's back from Catherine's unhinged girlfriend Roxy, and draws jealousy from his lover/therapist Beth. Can Nick find out who the real killer is before he becomes a victim? Buy your ticket and find out. Basic Instinct began, as many screenplays used to, with a very simple premise. In his autobiography Hollywood Animal, a memoir, Eszterhas writes that he wanted to flip the script from his 1980s thrillers like Jagged Edge and Betrayed, where a woman is manipulated by a charming man. This becomes something of a thought experiment for the 1990s. What if we gender flipped the usual 80s formula? Regarding the film's reliance on sex, Eszterhas says that he found excitement in the manipulation, not the sex itself. The sex is more instrumental than experiential, and is tied to the femme fatale's duplicity and psychopathy. Eszterhas wrote the sex to be significantly less explicit than director Paul Verhoeven eventually shot it. In fact, that was a bone of contention between them initially. And Eszterhas was so incensed with Verhoeven's changes that he walked off the project in a notorious huff. After a tense 9-month standoff, during which Verhoeven brought in his own screenwriter to rework the script, Verhoeven relented and reverted back to Eszterhas's original. I bring all this up because these are the types of things that we need in order to interpret the preferred reading of the film. In his paper on television consumption, Stuart Hall, who could arguably be called the father of modern media studies, laid out his model for how audiences consume a text. Contrary to the linear model, in which the media text is conceptualized, crafted, and produced by an author before being distributed to a passive audience, Hall explained that the audience is far more involved in deciding what the meaning of a given text is. Hall's model became known as reception theory, which simply means that the audience is active in receiving the text rather than passive. How you interpret a film is based on the strength of the argument provided for how you should interpret it. There is no right or wrong, just defended and undefended. Inherent in the theory is that all forms of art carry with them some form of ideology. A drama is tragic because of the way the culture feels about death or sadness. A slasher movie works because a culture thinks that murder is wrong. A rom-com works because everyone wants to see the couple get together at the end. The because part is the underlying thing that connects with audiences and makes the thing work. But because it's cultural, it doesn't always work for everyone, or at least it doesn't work in the same way. As part of reception theory, Hall distinguished among types of readings. He noted that the author of the work generally wants us to take something from it, and this reading is called the dominant or preferred reading. A resistant reading, however, takes an alternate or oppositional view to the author's ideology. It's important to emphasize that resistant or oppositional reading is intentional. It's not merely a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation of the preferred reading. And although this exchange usually happens between the author and the audience, it can also happen within authorship if the writers have different ideologies. This is most notable in the third Star Wars trilogy, in which J.J. Abrams, son of a veteran television producer father and veteran screenwriter mother, sets up a trilogy about the importance of family and heritage, only to have 16th Street Mall hippie busker Rian Johnson come in for the second movie to tell everyone, "Nah, you don't have to be special to be a hero." And then Abrams returned for the third movie and basically said, "Well, actually, you really have to be a legacy." Both of those ideologies make sense considering the author, they just don't make sense together. Usually, resistance reading happens among marginalized groups when the dominant narrative appeals most to the mainstream audience that may not be critical of its own ideology. In the case of Basic Instinct, you don't really have to dig very deeply to find authorial intent.
I thought it would be fun to do a movie about a man being manipulated by a woman who is brilliant, omnisexual, and evil.
That was all planned by Catherine Trammell. That's why I call her always the devil, because who could plan something so precisely?
You can't do a picture where evil triumphs at the end. Is that the message we want to send? That evil triumphs?
And there you have it. Basic Instinct is a classic film noir about a cop who loses everything when he is seduced by an evil succubus of a woman. That is the preferred reading of Basic Instinct from the three major creative forces behind it. It's Samson and Delilah. And while the film leaves a series of maddeningly unanswered questions, it does give us enough for a coherent preferred reading. So let's start there.
You're dealing with someone very dangerous and very ill.
When we meet Detective Nick Curran, he's on the wagon in terms of drinking, smoking, and cocaine. He's doing well in therapy, and he's celibate.
Start developing calluses.
He tells his therapist, Beth, that he's only concerned with the job. Nick's restraint here is akin to a classical stoicism. Although, while the Stoics control their excesses for virtue and self-improvement, Nick seems to do it out of necessity. This is not a guy who can have just one drink, and he will cease to be a functioning human being, let alone a functioning cop, if he falls off the wagon. Nick is not a good man, but he's trying to be. And that's why the infamous interrogation scene works so well. Think about what is happening in the larger context of who Nick Curran is. He's a problem child cop who is in the internal affairs doghouse after multiple shooting incidents. The other cops seem to like him personally, but they also seem exasperated with the kind of public scrutiny his brand of recklessness brings. At some point prior to the film, his wife died by suicide, and he was into the booze and cocaine hardcore. And it seemed like all this is tied together in his impulse control problems. So if just one wrong Jenga block is pulled out, the whole thing collapses. The Nick Currans of the world don't start drinking while avoiding promiscuity and reckless behavior. It's all interconnected. Sobriety is a bitch, you know? Catherine already knows this going in, and she uses the interrogation scene to ensnare him. There are a number of breakdowns on the internet about how Paul Verhoeven and cinematographer Jan de Bont blocked the scene to give Catherine the upper hand against this collection of Aqua Velva and Rolaids that has the nerve to call itself the San Francisco Police Department.
Exactly what did you have in mind, Mr. Corelli?
But I want to focus specifically on her and Nick, since that is what her real goal is. Nick, of course, is always her quarry, so she starts by tempting him with another cigarette offer.
Would you like a cigarette, Nick?
At this point, smoking had to be the easiest temptation to give in to. Most of the station is probably carrying. And once that falls, the rest is easy. Over the course of the interview, she continues to single out Nick specifically for her responses, turning the interrogation from Catherine versus the police to Catherine versus the police versus Nick.
Have you ever f***ed on cocaine, Nick?
And after the interrogation, she asks for a ride back to her house, which Nick obliges, almost in the same way that Sam Malone works at a bar in Cheers to combat his alcoholism. He has to prove he can hold his hand over the fire. But Nick, not surprisingly, is woefully overconfident. Immediately after dropping Catherine off, Nick goes to a bar and falls off the wagon. Importantly, during this scene, his entire support system also falls apart.
What you doing, Hoss? I haven't had a drink in 3 months. All right with you, cowboy?
Gus questions his drinking, his lieutenant thinks that Nick and Catherine know each other somehow, and the dickhead internal affairs guy starts some shit because he's a dickhead.
You back on the blackjack? Shooter?
Nick's only form of support is Jean Triplehorn's Dr. Beth Garner, but he screws that up too. Keyed up, Nick accompanies Dr. Garner back to her residence. As the film has suggested, Nick's exposure to Catherine and her taunts triggers a loss of control inside him. He started drinking again, and now he flat out rapes Dr. Garner in her apartment, trying to reassert some control over his life. When he asks her for a cigarette afterwards, she knows all of their progress is gone. This guy is an 8-ball away from completing the backslide. Nick begins a torrid sexual affair with Catherine as she bases her next murder mystery on him. And this is where the A and B plot converge in a cat and cat game. The power struggle between the two is whether Nick can withstand Catherine's debauched distractions and convince her to join him in a healthy, traditional, monogamous, heterosexual relationship, or if she'll get him to fall apart as a person and a detective.
Dumb son of a bitch, you f***ed her.
These threats get resolved when signs point to Dr. Garner, as it's revealed she had a sexual relationship with Catherine in college that she hid from the police. Catherine even intimates that Beth was obsessed with her.
I slept with her once. She started following me around, taking my picture.
When Gus investigates, he gets stabbed to death, presumably by Dr. Garner, who is in the same hallway and is shot by Nick when she refuses to comply with his orders.
Take him out!
With the mystery seemingly solved, Catherine returns to Nick and they agree to a committed monogamous heterosexual relationship before it's revealed Catherine is keeping an ice pick under her bed, implying that she orchestrated the whole thing and will not be in that committed monogamous heterosexual relationship after all. This ending leaves a lot open and is made even more fascinating through an addition by Verhoeven that was not in the script. More on that in a minute.
The common misconception, I think, is that both the police and Nick think that Beth was setting up Catherine, and that the case is over now that Beth is dead, but that the final shot lets us know that Nick is unwittingly sleeping with a murderer, and it's only a matter of time before she kills him too. I think the more accurate interpretation is that Nick knows exactly who Catherine is, but he's so arrogant that he thinks that his magic penis has cured her over bisexuality and her bloodlust. That's why Roxy was trying to kill him, because she saw something she'd never seen before. Which, as far as Nick is concerned, is the greatest dick down since David met Bathsheba.
I thought it was the of the century.
When Catherine shows up at his apartment at the end, tearful and vulnerable, telling him he's so dear to her that she's petrified of losing him and that's why she pushed him away, he thinks he literally f***ed the immorality out of her. He understands that she had to kill Gus because Gus was going to figure her out eventually and come between them.
Why doesn't Gus like me?
And he knows that she still has the power and maybe even the latent urge to kill him. But she chooses not to because it was
of the century.
See, if she tries, she can control those sinful urges. One piece of information that lends credence to this is a brief shot when Catherine tells Nick she's finished her book and she no longer needs him. The crux of the scene is that Catherine is breaking it off with Nick, so the brief shot of him reading the printout of the novel is a bit of Verhoeven sleight of hand. The passage Nick reads describes Gus's murder in detail hours before it happens. In the screenplay, Nick stays behind in the car while Gus goes to investigate a lead. Nick has a sudden realization and races to save Gus, but the script never really tells us what set Nick off, other than maybe Gus's dopey line about how he has to meet her alone. In the actual film, everything happens the same way, except Nick has just come from Catherine's house where he glanced over a passage about the main character's partner being killed. That's the realization he has that makes him chase Gus down. It also explains Nick's 1,000-yard stare in the police station as everyone else lays the murders at Beth's feet. Nick has always suspected Catherine as the killer.
But I'll nail you anyway.
And now he knows it because he read the passage before Gus was killed. So the vacant look on Nick's face is him taking in the depths of just how intricate Catherine's web is.
She's evil! She's brilliant!
And probably a little bit the sinking feeling of how he's not repulsed in knowing that. The final scene then is him thinking that Catherine has gotten both the murder and bisexuality out of her system. But he's not ignorant as to who Catherine is. He's just too arrogant to care, thinking, like an animal trainer, that he can dick whip her into submission and domestication.
Like minks raise rugrats and live happily ever after.
And as far as we're concerned, he can, because we don't know what happens after the final fade out. It's a pretty dark misogynistic read, but it's interesting how that one little shot gives everything that comes after it a different context. Regardless of how you interpret the smaller scenes, The story is still of a flawed man done in by a manipulative woman, and on that level, it kinda sucks as a movie. Yeah, I think at face value, this is just not a good film in spite of its great cinematography. And it's almost entirely due to the screenplay.
He got off before he got off.
All of the male characters are cartoonishly misogynistic and sound like they're in a high school locker room rather than a professional environment.
You know, sometimes I can't tell shit from Shinola, Doc.
So Catherine isn't exactly facing an Algonquin round table here. Every woman in this movie is some degree of psychopathic or emotionally overwrought. And the murder mystery at the heart of it is so convoluted that Catherine would have to be clairvoyant to ensure that everything came off the way that it did. As Jan de Bont admits on the commentary track,
yes, it might not be in character, but the plot demands it to do it this way.
Most critics, along with Esterhaus and Verhoeven, have chosen to focus on the filmmaking rather than any social commentary that the film might have engaged in. This was the view shared by Time magazine film critic Richard Schickel, who described the film as having too intricate, not entirely persuasive plotting, and faulted the film for not definitively answering its whodunit. And if one focuses on the formalist elements, the direction, the acting, the cinematography, the score, and the script, one will find a fresh coat of gloss slathered on lowbrow direct-to-video pulp, a lavish production of sexual excess produced for horny goofs by horny goofs. And that's where the film resided in the critical zeitgeist for nearly 30 years. But there was a large segment of the audience that felt that the film wasn't merely mid, but dangerous.
I don't have luck with women.
You're dealing with someone very dangerous.
There was this girl.
And very ill.
I met when I was in college. I slept with her once. She started following me around, taking my picture.
Prior to the release of the film, the gay activist group Queer Nation received a leaked copy of the script and immediately went to war with Verhoeven, Esterhaus, and the studio. Queer Nation was a New York-based activist group formed to combat skyrocketing anti-gay hate crimes. Their fear was that yet another queer killer was going to cement the idea that sexual deviance was inextricably intertwined with moral deviance. And in fact, that was Esterhaus's description of Catherine's sexuality to a T. One of the key linchpins to media literacy and dominant readings is understanding whether the movie wants us to believe a thing or just that the characters believe a thing about the world, and we don't necessarily have to agree with them.
I was embarrassed. It was the only time I've been with a woman.
You'll frequently hear media critics say, portrayal does not necessarily equate to endorsement. And that's true, but it's also irrelevant to the impact that it has.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
The cult of finance was actually accelerated by this film.
The worry here, and it's acknowledged in reception theory, is that when an audience engages with a piece of media, they don't just observe it, they internalize part of the ideology.
You want to find this bomb? This is what it's gonna take. Killing a witness? That's a problem with people like you, George. You want results, but you never want to get your hands dirty. I'd start rolling up your sleeves.
Waterboarding would be a bad thing to do. I'm looking for Jack Bauer at that time, let me tell you.
And this doesn't mean I watch Halloween and it makes me go out and stab people, which is a debunked theory called direct effects theory. It's more like we all drink from a common water supply, and if I dump a teaspoon of strychnine in, we're probably fine, because it's a tiny bit of poison and a large amount of water. But if everyone drops a teaspoon of strychnine in, our water is eventually deadly, but no one person is really responsible. So we've diffused responsibility for why the water is poisoned. No one is going to change their worldview based on basic instinct alone. But it's another teaspoon of strychnine that includes Rope, Strangers on a Train, Silence of the Lambs, Windows, Dressed to Kill, and Cruising, among a mountain of others. Eventually the well gets poisoned, and it's the kind of poison that disproportionately affects certain people.
You know, they came in and they were screaming about, like, pedophilia and saying things like, we have to save the children.
But Esterhaus and Queer Nation were not working from two different scripts. They were working from two different interpretations of the same script. Neither one correct or incorrect. For Esterhaus, and I'm guessing most filmmakers prior to the turn of the century, saw the work as something that stood alone, printed on paper, shot on film, and isolated from the world as a unique piece of art. Queer Nation was viewing the film as part of a larger cinematic ecosystem. Esterhaus acknowledges this in his book and in several interviews. The rift between Verhoeven and Esterhaus was reopened when Esterhaus agreed to meet with gay activists after Verhoeven had refused. Despite being willing to show up and listen, Esterhaus's meeting exposed a sort of stubborn cluelessness about queer sexuality. Which would be fine, if he wasn't the writer of a movie that heavily relied on queer sexuality. His book describes an exchange in which he defended the use of the queer serial killer by noting that Catherine's omnisexuality meant that she was both homosexual and heterosexual, and therefore the general public would not come away with the view that a gay woman was a killer.
Peter, hold on to that thought, because I'm going to explain to you when we get home all the things that are wrong with that statement.
It is a point of view Eszterhas shares with both film critic Richard Schickel and film historian John Kenneth Muir. Bisexuals are half straight, so criticism of Catherine in the context of the pantheon of gay serial killers is not relevant. Eszterhas went so far as to tell the group of gay activists that they were wrong on what it means to be a bisexual. But when they weren't having it, he relented and offered to take another pass at the script based on their suggestions. That's when Verhoeven stood up and declared that he would not be making any changes, and told the crowd that they would just have to trust him. In the end, the only change that came out of the meeting seems to have been the elimination of the use of the word dyke. When nothing of substance changed, Queer Nation and other activist groups tried to disrupt the production by blowing whistles and making noise during the film's exterior scenes. This led to the film's producer, Alan Marshall, trying to make a citizen's arrest of the protesters. Ultimately, the protests were unsuccessful in shutting down the production, and when the film premiered, most of it was intact, minus the bits that the MPAA demanded be cut out for an R rating. Unable to stop the film from being made, an ad hoc group of gay activists formed the group Catherine Did It to picket outside of theaters. Many filmgoers reported being annoyed by the spoiled ending, but it didn't hurt the box office receipts. The film grossed $350 million worldwide and was a smash hit on home video as well. To understand where Queer Nation was coming from, you have to understand the context of queer-straight relations in 1992.
He's damaging people's lives in a very individual sort of way. He's ostracizing people. He is creating a circumstance as well that allows people to discriminate against people with AIDS.
It's true that with the onset of AIDS in the early 1980s, there was a paranoia surrounding even being associated with gay people. Most school districts had regulations that openly gay teachers could be fired. We were 12 years away from Lawrence v. Texas, the case that eliminated blanket sodomy laws, and more than 2 decades away from Obergefell, the decision that legalized gay marriage.
If you do not believe it is fiscally responsible to throw open the doors of the United States Treasury to be raided by the homosexual movement, then the choice is very clear.
It seemed like it was open season on gays and lesbians, and given that gay panic was a routinely successful tactic in criminal gay bashing cases, it's not without merit. Writing in Bitch Media, cultural critic Ilham Zoller writes, Basic Instinct manages to have not one but 3 queer women characters, including 2 canonically bisexual ones, and they are all written as stereotypes. And it's hard to argue against that, as bisexual women are either depraved bisexuals or confused bisexuals, and Roxy immediately dials it up to murder the second her polyamorous girlfriend has an orgasm. Concerns from critics about the film's homophobia were mostly dismissed by straight critics as the hysteria of militant activists. And then the rush to reevaluate the film in the late 20-teens, the criticisms are always referenced as the quaint squawkings of a confused and naive populace. Muir, in trying to deflect criticism, writes, Although Roxy is clearly depicted as a murderer, the story with Catherine is much less clear-cut. It is plain she indulges in all sorts of passions, from smoking to cocaine to heterosexual sex to homosexual sex. But she is not strictly a lesbian, so the anger of the gay community is misplaced. The film also features Michael Douglas as a totally average fucked up cop, one who falls off the wagon, shoots innocent people, boozes it up, and snorts cocaine. Yet there were no police activists complaining about Basic Instinct's depiction of them. This, unfortunately, is the type of argument one would expect a first-year rhetoric student to make on their first paper before receiving it back covered in red ink by their professor. Nick is a totally fucked up cop, but he's hardly average. In fact, he's treated as an outlier by the other characters, by the story, and by the filmmakers. There are a dozen cop characters, and they all treat Nick like he's ready to go off. Which, given his history, is probably true. The point is, there are 4 women in this film, 3 of them are gay or bi, and all 4 of them are implied to have been murderous. That's 100% of the sapphic women being portrayed as probable murderers, and only 8% of the cops being portrayed as fucked up. It's just a bad point all around by Muir. Feminist author Camille Paglia comes for Queer Nation even harder in the commentary.
So this is a good case, I think, of the really grotesque elitism of a certain pang of intelligentsia that pretends to speak for the people, but it is in fact wildly divorced from actual popular tastes.
Polia's criticism of Queer Nation and activist groups in general is that they tend to focus on New York and Los Angeles and rarely represent the actual needs of the people they claim to serve. After all, if people actually thought the film was homophobic, it wouldn't have made all that money. Polia's point here is more grounded than Muir's, but it also assumes that all people will be equally well served by the free marketplace of ideas. And film culture is littered with examples of why that's not the case. But maybe the best criticism of all came from Roger Ebert, who cut through the bickering to essentially say, yeah, the gay representation in this movie sucks. But then again, everyone sucks in this movie, particularly Michael Douglas's character. Ebert also went on to acknowledge that the trend of gay characters was disturbing, which of course is correct.
In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter if one film is homophobic or if one series passes the Bechdel test. It's the trend that affects people. Even if we were to set aside the homophobia, the film's treatment of women, gay or straight, leaves a lot to be desired. Beth and Catherine, who never have any scenes together, are pitted against one another in a sort of Betty and Veronica dichotomy. Beth, the nice, loyal girl who is boring in bed, and Catherine, the sexpot who is equally likely to stab you or break your dick off with wild sex. This is actually a long-time trope in media geared toward men, where one woman is a lovelorn matron and the other is a sexually aggressive Jezebel. And that would be bad enough if the men in the film didn't castigate both of them for those reasons. The other characters snicker behind Beth's back about how loyal and caring she is for Nick.
She misses me. Boy, when that girl mates, it's for life.
Even after Nick rapes her in her apartment, she covers for him and provides something of an alibi when he's brought in for questioning in Nielsen's murder. And to top it all off, her final words after Nick shoots her are, "I loved you." It's certainly believable to think that she was stalking Catherine because all indicators are that she doesn't even exist without Nick. Conversely, if you've seen the movie or anything from pop culture over the past 30 years, I shouldn't have to go into the ways that Catherine's description of her sex life elicit the same odd reaction that the dinosaurs do in Jurassic Park.
Would you tell us the nature of your relationship with Mr. Boz?
I had sex with him for about 1.5 years. I liked having sex with him. He wasn't afraid of experimenting. I like men like that. Men who give me pleasure.
If a woman wants a monogamous relationship, she's a clinger. And if she enjoys sex with multiple partners, she's a literal freak of nature. The Madonna whore dichotomy is well-worn territory in the genre, and to see it show up here is a little on the nose for an erotic thriller. But sometimes I guess the classics don't go out of style.
That being said, it is interesting that I've talked for 4,805 words without mentioning the most important part of Basic Instinct even once.
So, what did you pay, Nielsen?
Is me the policeman that you shot, Shooter?
What if I ask you not to call me Shooter, right?
Okay, what if I call you Mickey?
My wife called me Nikki.
Yeah, I know, but I like it. Cheers. My friends call me Catherine.
What did Bobby Vasquez call you?
Pitch, mostly, but he meant it affectionately. Do you need a Coke?
Well, there's some in the fridge.
It's really not the same thing, though, is it?
It's hard to oversell just how important Sharon Stone's performance is to both the financial and artistic success of the film. If you love the film at all, you probably love Stone's iconic portrayal of Catherine. Even the film's harshest critics acknowledge Stone carried the film. Sharon Stone struts on with enough come-on carnality to singe the screen. Stone, in her star-making performance, is as hot and sexy as she is ice-pick cold. Sharon Stone delivers a stellar performance as the dangerous and sensual femme fatale. Sharon Stone radiates on screen in Paul Verhoeven's erotic thriller. Sharon Stone's Catherine Trammell is a Slay F5 cunt-nado that just tore through downtown Serviapolis.
Yeah, I don't think that last one was Rotten Tomatoes.
Stone brings the appropriate emotional rollercoaster to Catherine, whether it's manipulation or not, and the double entendres are delivered with the perfect amount of snark to let the double meaning land.
Do you have any Coke?
Got a Pepsi in the fridge.
Oh, it's not really the same thing now, is it?
It's funny that Verhoeven and Esterhaus describe the movie as a play on Esterhaus's earlier work or classical noir films, but when they do interviews or retrospectives, the only thing that they can talk about is Sharon Stone and Catherine Trammell. Nobody talks about Michael Douglas or the nuances of Nick Curran. One might say that Basic Instinct isn't even about Nick Curran. It's a film about Catherine. It's important to keep in mind that Sharon Stone only got the part after no less than a dozen actresses turned it down. Lena Olin refused to work with Paul Verhoeven. Kelly McGillis, Muriel Hemingway, Meg Ryan, Julia Roberts, Michelle Pfeiffer, Demi Moore, and Kathleen Turner were just some of the actresses who turned down the role due to the nudity requirements. Sharon Stone was already seen as washed up by 29. She had been in Hollywood for a decade and had supporting roles in everything from Wes Craven's early supernatural horror Deadly Blessing to one of the myriad of Police Academy sequels, to Verhoeven's own Total Recall. Michael Douglas had demanded a star of equal caliber to him so that if the movie flopped, he wouldn't be held responsible. After all, in 1992, no one would expect the name Sharon Stone to open a film on day one.
Then I try something you've never had before.
Is that a line?
No, it's a drink. Seagram's Golden Wine Cooler. It's wet, it's dry, it's new, and it's Seagram's.
You sound like a commercial.
Everyone else in Hollywood seemed to feel the same way, with one agent implying that she'd be better suited for porn than the lead in a big-budget studio movie. And yet, for everyone who asked in 1991, who is Sharon Stone, we can definitively say in 2024, she's the one who makes the goddamn movie work.
You're dealing with someone very dangerous and very ill.
Resistant readings happen when the audience remembers, I'm actually under no obligation to adopt the worldview of the filmmaker, and using the building blocks given to them by the filmmaker creates their own interpretation. A resistant reader would note that Verhoeven and Esterhaus tell us through casting, shot selection, and dialogue that Detective Nielsen is a giant dickhead. He keeps needling Nick every chance he gets, calling him shooter, and just generally being a douchebag. And this trope was so prevalent in the late 1980s and early 1990s that it's almost invisible here. As an audience, we see this character and we think to ourselves, damn, why can't Internal Affairs just leave this guy alone and let him do his job?
But if you're paying attention, Nielsen hates Curran because... Let me check my notes here. Nick was getting high on cocaine and shot innocent tourists. There might be a little justification to avoid the Curran hive on this one. That's all I'm saying. But an audience in 1992 wouldn't read Nick's actions that way.
It's bullshit, okay? You know it is.
I know it is.
Cops are the good guys and should be able to shoot whoever they want. And if they're being played by Michael Douglas, they shouldn't be hassled about it either.
Okay, in fairness, he was really charming in Romancing the Stone.
Just as queer audiences jeered the film in 1992 for its portrayal of a bisexual killer, the film's reclamation has largely been at the hands of queer millennial critics who have been re-evaluating Paul Verhoeven's work from the 1990s.
Different places.
Again, taken at face value, Showgirls is a laughably bad take on staying true to yourself when the rest of the world is an irretrievable Sodom. And Starship Troopers is a masterclass in not getting the point of Robert Heinlein's original novel. But we're no longer in the late 1990s, and shows like Drag Race have given mainstream audiences a new appreciation for camp. The last decade or so has pushed literal fascist ideology back to the forefront of our minds. So it makes sense why we're reevaluating these films with a resistance toward the way that they were first interpreted. This is why Bitch Media, the publication that posted the critical piece I cited earlier, also posts an article from another queer writer on how Catherine Trammell is a symbol of empowerment. Of course, just as there were gay viewers in 1992 who had no problem with the film, there are LGBT critics that still have issues in 2024. People are complex, go figure. I do, however, want to spotlight the great work of Brooke Solomon and Jordan Gustafson of the Queer Quadrant podcast, and Trace Thurman and Joe Lipsett of the Horror Queers podcast and Bloody Disgusting. Both podcasts have episodes dissecting the film, and you should go listen to those while you're returning your shopping cart. The 1992 criticisms of Catherine Trammell were that she was a bisexual psychopath who killed a cop and used her sexuality to manipulate a misogynist and maybe kill him too.
Yeah, the kids have a word for that. Based.
It's true that in 1992, the context for the audience to consume the film was made up of mostly homophobic films that painted gay people as killers. When you consume and interpret a film, you're not doing that in a cultural vacuum. You're doing it based on cultural experience. And the most salient psychosexual thriller prior to this was Cruising. where cop Al Pacino goes so far undercover into the gay club scene that he thinks that he might be becoming a killer. Even just pretending to be gay can cause you to become homicidal. Not everything can be that episode of The Golden Girls that you like, but what wasn't apparent at the time is that learning to interpret a text is an evolving process.
You never dyed them up?
No, Johnny liked to use his hands too much. I like hands and fingers.
While I don't think it's very much like me, really, it protects me from other people because people are terrified of me.
In 1994, HBO released an unheralded film noir from genre favorite Jean Dahl called The Last Seduction. The film starred Peter Berg, Bill Pullman, and Linda Fiorentino. The film was intended to be another in a long line of Basic Instinct knockoffs that the network threw out to pad the nighttime schedule. But viewers were surprisingly enamored with Fiorentino's performance as Bridget Gregory. Well, I mean, not surprising if you've seen the movie. The film became such a hit that the studio tried to push for an Academy Award nomination for Fiorentino, but she was ineligible. The important thing for us, though, is that Bridget is wholly amoral, uses sex to manipulate a transphobic, misogynistic doofus, and pits him against her abusive husband, eventually killing the husband and framing the doofus for it. It's a character who should be immediately familiar to Basic Instinct fans. But unlike Basic Instinct, where Nick Curran is intended by the writer and the director to be the protagonist, The Last Seduction cast the femme fatale as the protagonist. And this was a conscious change in the script, as screenwriter Steve Baranchek initially had big lunk Peter Berg as the hero. Had he left it like that, the film would have been just another in a shit million body heat ripoffs. Instead, we ride along as Bridget recruits Berg's character for casual sex, in between sessions of berating him for being a hick, kills the private investigator hired to find her, and weaponizes the town's racism to get away with it.
He was going to impale me with his...
And uses Berg's transphobia to coerce him into killing her husband. And all the while, because she's the smartest, most cunning, most ruthless, and most clever person in the room at any given moment, we are rooting for her. Morality be damned. After all, she only took the money because her husband slapped her. And her schemes only work because of the worst traits in everyone else.
What did he want? He wouldn't say. He was black, though.
The sheriff having a racial bias is necessary to her scheme. If he didn't, she wouldn't have gotten away with it. Mike, the Peter Berg character, is only manipulable because of his transphobia. He doesn't have to be transphobic. He could just not, and he wouldn't be going to prison for the rest of his life. None of this is to compare Bridget and Catherine as characters as written, but I think Bridget, a character in a similar film noir crime thriller 3 years after Basic Instinct was released, teaches us how to interpret Catherine Trammell in a new way. If you're willing to overlook the moral aspect, which most people are with many other anti-heroes, Catherine possesses a lot of desirable traits. And in 2024, there's considerably more representation than there was in 1992. The stakes just seem less important when Catherine is one of many LGBT characters. That makes it easier to embrace the bisexual serial killer for her power while ignoring her morality.
What about the people he murdered?
What murder?
And there are several elements of the script that have lent themselves to resistant readings. In her book Fatal Women, Lesbian Sexuality and the Mark of Aggression, literary critic Linda Hart dedicates an entire chapter to differentiating Basic Instinct from whodunits, essentially saying that if you're coming through the details of whether Catherine committed a murder or if she manipulated Beth or Roxy into doing it, you're missing the point. Basic Instinct isn't a whodunit, and for Hart, it wasn't intended to be. Basic Instinct is a thriller. Like Hitchcock, Hart draws a stark contrast between the two genres. In a whodunit, the detective is someone who is defined by their ability to acquire facts, arrange them into a narrative, and to solve a mystery. In a thriller, the detective is defined by his lack of knowledge, of how the other characters, usually the femme fatale, are ahead of him and how some sort of character flaw will undo him if he can't overcome it. The point is not to solve the mystery. The point is to watch this guy squirm. And for that, who actually turned out to be the killer is irrelevant. And in fact, because the film doesn't give us a definitive answer to which of the women committed some of the killings, Hart's interpretation is that it's the concept of woman herself. After all, these women are largely interchangeable when it comes to the mystery. The thriller is a cynical deconstruction of the whodunit, and usually more downbeat. But the fact that it's transgressive against the whodunit requires it to recall many of the genre's characteristics. But if we consider this Catherine's movie and not Nick's, what we see at the end is not a revelation about Catherine's culpability or even her sexuality, but her agency, her power. She opts to continue her sexual relationship with Nick, but she also opts to retain part of her identity, and the film's refusal to answer a clear whodunit is part of that. If you're watching this far, you probably already know Laura Mulvey and visual pleasure and narrative cinema, but I'm going to recap it anyway. In her groundbreaking essay from 1975, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, film scholar Laura Mulvey adapts John Berger's 1972 concept of the gaze to explain how predominantly male filmmakers control storytelling and reproduce their fantasies for a large male audience. In general, what you would expect to see are female characters reduced to body parts within the frame, men being shown to be strong and in control, and sex largely shown as an act to arouse. To dumb it down to the most basic level, women are looked at and men do the looking. And in the end, like most things, it's not about pleasure, it's about power. For his part, Verhoeven has said he detests graphic sex for no purpose, and explains why the sex scenes in this film are so integral to the part. And it's hard to argue with that. A second piece to this, though, is how Verhoeven frames Catherine when she is looked at. Unlike most female characters, Catherine is always aware that she is being viewed. There is a scene early in the film where Catherine excuses herself to put on her infamous white dress, only for Nick to catch a glimpse of her naked body in a well-placed mirror. In a normal movie, this scene would be entirely shot for the male gaze. But later on the way back to Catherine's apartment, she tells Nick he knows she doesn't wear underwear.
I don't know anything that's not police business.
You know I don't wear any underwear. Don't you, Nick?
And of course, the famous interrogation scene is rife with moments where Catherine pushes and pulls her interrogators around the room with ease. And this is Verhoeven at his finest, because you could turn the sound off and still understand exactly what's going on through shot selection. Catherine being aware that she was being watched, as she no doubt is later on when she walks naked in front of a large plate glass window, gives her a level playing field. When one person looks and the other person performs, there is an exchange, rather than the first person taking something from the second person. The male gaze is subverted again after Catherine and Nick have sex for the first time. Catherine's bedroom has a mirror on the ceiling in which Nick watches Catherine perform oral sex on him. Catherine later tells Nick that she likes Roxy to watch her have sex. And the fact that Catherine and Roxy are near doppelgangers in the film leads one to believe that at least part of Catherine's pathology is autoeroticism. She likes watching herself have sex, and she likes having sex with someone who looks just like her. And I mean, yeah, wouldn't you? Nick discovers Roxy has been watching them the whole time without his consent. He is startled when she appears behind him in the mirror. Now it is Nick who is being watched unaware. While Eszterhas has a public disdain for feminism as a movement and as a theory, he does consistently write women who are experts in their field. And although they might be emotionally conflicted, usually because con men are trying to manipulate them, they are capable of figuring things out and moving forward.
When Mr. Arnold came back to see you, what did he tell you? He told me that the Baker Beach killings were not related to what happened to me.
Unlike many of her film noir predecessors who are sexually passive and dependent on men, Catherine is assertive and openly embraces sex. This is what throws the men in the interrogation room so quickly. While these guys are making gross inappropriate jokes at the Johnny Boz crime scene,
maybe the maid did it. She's 54 years old, weighs 240 pounds.
No bruises on the body.
It ain't the maid.
They're shocked when Catherine jumps right into the sex-positive fray. She actually seems to find it cute that Corelli's idea of sadomasochistic activities is being tied up with silk scarves. And although he is one of her most aggressive inquisitors, he's also the one that folds the quickest, nearly drowning in a pool of his own sweat. Part of what allows Catherine to be such a sexual iconoclast is that she is more powerful than any of the men in the department when it comes to finances. We're not told how successful of an author she is, but Captain Talcott doesn't even want to bring her in for questioning because he thinks she'll bury the department with high-priced lawyers. So she has buy your way out of a murder charge money. I guess that's somewhere around Stephenie Meyer level. Even Gus notes that Johnny Boz and Catherine have his and hers Picassos, to which Nick tellingly retorts,
"Hers is bigger."
Eszterhas certainly isn't shy about leaving Nick's inadequacies in full view of the audience, even if he's not aware that that's what he's doing. The running theory is that Nick Curran is Eszterhas and Douglas's idea of what a cool guy is, and Verhoeven is constantly making fun of them through his choices throughout the film. I'm not sold on the general consensus that Verhoeven is some kind of bad screenplay whisperer that can turn Gras into gold. He seems to embrace the ideas of fans and critics after the fact as if they were his own, but there's little contemporary evidence that he was being subversive. But maybe it's better that he doesn't realize that's what he's doing. It's why Douglas shows up at the club in a V-neck sweater, looking like the embodiment of the reason you can't bring your straight boyfriend to Pride anymore. It's why when Nick muses that Roxy is jealous because Catherine has never been like that before, Catherine practically laughs in his face. It's like she's calling him a virgin and lumping him in with Newman. It's really gotta be humbling to think that you just stormed the beaches at Normandy in sexual D-Day, only to have the woman treat it like it's an above-average order from Chipotle. And this is all aided by the fact that Michael Douglas shows up every day thinking that he's the main character. "I'm the star of the movie and she one-ups me at every turn," Esterhaus recalls Douglas complaining in the rewrite phase. Douglas vetoed his character doing full frontal, which is fine because it's a boundary, but he also vetoed his character being hinted at as bisexual. And if you're wondering where in the hell in the script that came from, check out some of the Easter eggs about George Zunz's Gus character online. I think you'll find them illuminating.
Why doesn't Gus like me?
Why indeed, Catherine? Why indeed? Douglas also had a clause in his contract that prevented Sharon Stone from receiving above the title credit. But that's what happens when the studio pays Douglas $15 million and Stone $500,000? Are you The point is, if Nick Curran is a self-important, egotistical doofus, then Michael Douglas comes off looking like a method actor during this production. But there's an underlying theme in Esterhaus's other work that, with a queer reading, explains why the ending of Basic Instinct might appeal to LGBT viewers beyond love of Catherine, and it requires the audience to accept the film's premise that sexuality and bloodlust are inseparable, but they're metaphorical. In Esterhaus's follow-up Sliver, Sharon Stone falls for hot weirdo Billy Baldwin, only to find out that he's a creepy, perverted serial killer who hides cameras in everyone's apartment so that he can watch them all day. In the ending released in theaters, she finds his gun and destroys his monitors before finishing with the cringeworthy final line,
"Get a life."
It's a normal person with normal values and normal sexual modesty, rejecting an abnormal person with abnormal values and abnormal sexual appetites. Normalcy restored. But in Esterhaus's original ending, Carly, the Sharon Stone character, discovers the Baldwin character is a killer and decides she wants to be with him anyway. And in the third act, there's a lot of evidence that she's just into it. It's not something that she's, quote-unquote, willing to overlook. All of this, whether it's Catherine's consistent demonstrations of her sexual power over Nick and other men, her unapologetic embrace of female sexuality, and the film's positioning of Nick Curran as an arrogant dunce, gives Basic Instinct a different vibe than it had when we initially saw it in 1992. If anything, this is proof that films are living documents. They are constantly being reinterpreted by every successive generation. And it may happen that the next generation will turn back against the film, based on the shit that they have to go through. And that's something that Hall accounted for when he came up with reception theory. The film is not just handed off to us from the mount. It's a first volley that allows the audience and filmmaker to filter it through their own lenses and enjoy or hate whatever comes out of that process. And that makes media studies a fascinating time capsule for what's going on in a culture at large. Stay cool, stay safe, wash your hands, return your shopping carts, make good choices, and I'll see you next time.